Hi, this is Dr. Andrew Rimby, host of the Ivory Tower Boiler Room Arts and Culture podcast. If you haven't, please take a second to rate us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Please make sure you're following us on Spotify or Apple. And did you know we have a YouTube channel? Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It really means a lot. You can actually see a lot of our video episodes on YouTube. And if you don't want to listen to any ads that are going to happen throughout the episode, even though I love all of our sponsors, of course, you can listen to our ad-free episodes on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Ivory Tower Boiler Room. And right now, you can get 1 week for free to see all of the ad-free episodes. And all of those episodes are also video episodes. So you can get to watch me, the guest, and you can also listen to all of Mary's True Crime and Academia episodes ad-free. Okay, I hope you enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. This is Dr. Andrew Rimby, and I'm so excited because I'm joined with one of the writers from the Gay and Lesbian Review. So today I'm going to profile three writers. Two of them are joining me on Zoom. The other isn't able to, so I'm going to discuss his responses. But the first guest that I have is from the January-February issue, which is called Strange Fruit. And it is an article that is so excitingly titled Bottom Shamed by Mark Twain, written by William Benemann, who, so you all know, is an author who wrote Men in Eden, William Drummond Stewart, and Same Sex Desire in the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade, and Unruly Desires, American Sailors and Homosexualities in the Age of Sail. So, I asked William if he could just give us a little background about first this whole title for your article. Like, why are you calling it bottom shamed? Like, how is Mark Twain involved with bottom shaming?
Well, that's a sort of a long story that is basically what the article is about. For people who are familiar with Huckleberry Finn, which you all should be because it's a very interesting book. There is an incident in the book where Huck and Jim, the enslaved African American who is traveling with him, encounter two con men who put on a show in a small town in Arkansas, and they want to do scenes from Shakespeare. And the town is crowded because there's an evangelical tent meeting in town, but almost nobody comes to the Shakespeare play. So they decided that they need to do something that's a little bit raunchier to get the crowds in. And so they put on this play performance that in the book is called The King's Camelopard or The Royal Nunsearch. And what it is one of the characters who goes by the name of the King of France comes out totally nude, his body painted, striped in colors, and he climbs around stage, just crawls around. And the audience is very angry that that's all they're going to see, and they almost have a riot, and the players have to leave town. Well, there's something about that scene that hasn't really worked in the book. It seems to start. Twain starts to describe the scene, and then Huck, the narrator, pulls back and said, "Oh, it was really wild. I can't really talk more about it." And people have always thought that was very, very strange because Huck does go on and on in other places in the novel. When Twain's manuscript for Huckleberry Finn was available for scholars to read, they discovered that up until the very last moment, until Twain was working on the galleys for the novel, that play that they performed was called The Burning Shame, and that's all he knew about it. So there's been this scholarly debate about what was the burning shame, what was it that Twain decided that he had to censor for the book, and it wasn't until the early 1960s that a literary scholar put forward the idea that what it was a performance where when the king came out with all of his clothes off, the other performer, the duke, was supposed to stick a lighted candle up his butt, and then he's supposed to climb around the stage with a lighted candle. The idea being it'd be humorous to as the candle burned down and got closer and closer to him. So, and that that play, which is known as the Burning Shame, is what I took the title of the book from. And I look into, first of all, the scholarly debate of identifying what the Royal Nonsuch really was before it was censored, and the sort of history of this whole play that actually has um, quite a long history of using a candle in this sort of performance.
So,
Yeah.
William, how long have you been writing for the Gay and Lesbian Review?
Well, the first article that I published was in 2021, and I've published about maybe a dozen essays with them, all on the idea of gay men in 19th century America, which is my area.
Hmm. And is that because 19th century um, literature from a queer perspective, is that something that you studied at university, you taught? Like, how did all of that come to be?
Well, it's sort of a long, convoluted story that uh, evolved over time and seemed totally random while it was happening. And now I look back on it, it seems absolutely planned, but it wasn't. Um,
Mm. Yeah, what is
I
the story?
studied English literature at Berkeley. I did my undergraduate work in English literature. Um, Worked my way through college, working in the university library, and loved my job there. Loved the whole atmosphere of libraries. Decided I wanted to have that as my career. So I went on to go to library school at Berkeley and got a master's in librarianship with a specialty in law libraries. And so most of my career was in law libraries. First at Goldgate University here in San Francisco, and then at Harvard Law, and then I ended my career at Berkeley Law. I was the first archivist for the School of Law at Berkeley. But in between there, for 4 years, 1989 until 1993, I was head of the catalog department for the Bancroft Library at Berkeley, which is the rare book special collections library, um, sort of the equivalent of the Houghton or the Beinecke. And it's primarily a history collection. And that's what got me interested in history as a topic. Do you want more detail about how that went about? Or
No, I think that's helpful. Yeah. So, you know, before we got to, as a reader of your article on the Gay and Lesbian Review, um, like, was this the first time you were really looking into Mark Twain, or is Mark Twain like a author that you've always kind of been interested in with his history?
And actually, I came about it by accident. I was doing research for another article that I wrote on a gay couple named Jason Chamberlain and John Chaffee, who were a gay couple from Worcester, Massachusetts, who came to San Francisco for the gold rush in 1849. Uh, didn't strike it rich, but liked the atmosphere, liked the fact that they could be more open here. So they settled in the Bay Area, in the East Bay, in the foothills of Sierra, and they became sort of local celebrities. They were known as the Married Bachelors. Everybody recognized that they had a special relationship there that was like a marriage. Um, and so I was doing some background research on Chamberlain and Chaffee. Doing a JSTOR search and pulled up an article called Mark Twain's Burning Shame. And I thought that was intriguing. I had no idea what it was about. So I read the article and thought, oh, here's another essay for it that I could write. So I put it on my list of things to write. And it went back to it eventually. But before that, I was not really a big fan of Twain at all, but I became more as I was reading for the essay.
Mm. So your book, Unruly Desires, like, it seems what I love about your article is, you talk a lot about phallic this like phallic narrative of an illustration where in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, the artist E.W. Kemble had drawn Uncle Silas standing with his shoulders drawn back, you say, and his pelvic thrust forward, and young Huck Finn is gazing at his crotch, but like that there was actually an even more uncensored erotic illustration that happens in that scene. Like, can you explain how this even came to be? Like, why did an artist decide to draw an erect penis with Huckleberry Finn? Like, to me, it just seems like such a pairing that I would never put together. Like, it's just so out there. So, like, what is the and
Okay,
that's
well,
what your article's
the
about.
artist did not draw it.
Mm,
Right, right. Well, that's sort of a side story that I started off with because I think it's a humorous fact that happened in the history of the book. But the artist did not draw the penis. Somebody in the production line who was working with the plates scratched the penis onto the drawing that was already there, and
that's
it went
funny.
through the process. No one noticed it. It got bound into the books. 3,000 copies of the book were published and were distributed pre-publication copies to bookstores, stuff like that, before anyone noticed. Oh my God, Uncle Silas has a penis in this. So they had to pull all those 3,000 books back, slice out the page, put in one that doesn't have the penis on it. But there are a few copies didn't get censored, so they're still out there. And if you go online, there is. I found one illustration for somebody has the uncensored version of it, and I wanted to use it for the article, but it's a very poor reproduction. It really wasn't shown very well. So the illustration that's used for my essay is actually the one that's in the book that was published in the book after it was cleaned up.
Mm, mm. So, is there like, I know there has been speculation about Mark Twain's sexuality. Like, from what you've looked into, is there any kind of biographer or any conversation of Mark Twain perhaps having some kind of queer desire?
There's been speculation. There's been a couple articles and a biography. I really didn't go into deeply into Twain's life because that wasn't the focus that I wanted to do for the article. I wanted to focus on Huckleberry Finn. Um, my my feeling is that I don't want to label Twain because I think putting labels on people in the past is wrong and currently it's wrong. I think labels should be self-imposed, and Twain never did. Um, there are some suggestions that he may have had a close emotional relationship with men now and then. Um, from what I know about him, what I would say is that he could be considered an ally. Certainly, when he was in San Francisco, he was around a lot of men who were having sex with other men, and it didn't bother him. They were his friends. And as I mentioned towards the end of the article, um, when he was about to get married, he actually wrote to a bachelor couple that he lived with briefly in San Francisco and said, I wish you guys could come all the way to Connecticut to be married, just to be at my wedding because I would really love to have you there. And still recognizing them, excuse me, as a couple and wanting them to be there at this important stage in his life. So I would say he was an ally. I would not say that he went beyond that.
Yeah. So, like, getting into your fascination with what's going on with Huckleberry Finn, um, you know, even just teasing all of the listeners out there because, I want them to read your article so you don't have to give all the goods. But, you know, thinking about bottom shaming, I mean, first, the way that you're using this phrase bottom shamed, can you like explain, like in your opinion, in William Benemann's opinion, what is bottom shaming?
Have you heard me gush and obsess over one of my favorite magazines? It's called the Gay and Lesbian Review, a bi-monthly magazine of history, culture, and politics. Yes, focusing on all things LGBTQ arts and culture. So, from reviews like the new Daniel Craig film called Queer to musicals, theater, TV shows, the new February issue just was mailed to my house. Yes, I still get a physical copy of the magazine. There is a discussion about sodomy at the court of Louis the 14th, how Mark Twain was bottom shamed. Yeah, I know. A scandalous title. I'm really curious what that means. And just so many conversations that will have you doing a Google search to find either the book that's being reviewed, the TV show that's being talked about, the film that's being discussed. I love the Gay and Lesbian Review, and they gave us an exclusive code. So all you ITBR listeners, make sure that you write down the code ITBR50. Go to glreview.org and you can get either the digital or print subscription for 50% off. Yes, 50% off. Use that code ITBR50. I hope you enjoy your reading.
So you all know that I am such a fan of musical theater and classic movies. So I can't wait for you all to listen to one of my good friends' podcasts. It's called That Old Gay Classic Cinema, hosted by Christian Garcia. It's a podcast that looks at classic cinema films that we know and love. And he was inspired by Turner Classic Movies and The Great Movie Ride. Remember that amazing ride where the Wicked Witch of the West rose up in a burst of flame in Disney? That was one of my favorite rides. I'm so sad it closed. So, while looking at classic films, Christian is so excited to look at it with a queer lens. And he brings on friends like myself to talk about all of these films. I was on the first episode when we discussed The Sound of Music. I've been on an episode of Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo. He just released an episode about the Philadelphia story. He's done Meet Me in St. Louis, Sweet Charity, Psycho, Mary Poppins, Hello Dolly. He had on Down the Yellow Brick Road hosts and the Garland Gab hosts to talk about The Wizard of Oz. So make sure that you listen to That Old Gay Classic Cinema on Apple and Spotify and follow him on TikTok and Instagram at That Old Gay Classic Cinema. Okay, start watching the classic movies and make sure you listen to Christian's podcasts.
Well, body shaming is saying that there's something really wrong about being a receiver of anal sex, and it feeds into this idea that it's okay as long as you're the inserter and not the insertee.
So,
and this whole play, The Burning Shame, is built around the idea that what the audience is seeing is something who is a man is being shamed, and that to me,
yeah, so
is what it's about.
how is like you have this really great discussion that I couldn't wait to ask you about, which is not that you say we should ignore all the racist um, controversies with Huckleberry Finn and all of its problematic elements, but you said like what's interesting is what's not really focused on or um, has kind of been like swept under the rug is the very erotic elements. Like, what are some of these erotic images, or like even what you're talking about, which is the play that happens in the novel? You know, what does the eroticism look like in Huckleberry Finn?
Well, I don't focus on eroticism in the essay. That second paragraph, the essay looks at Huckleberry Finn, looks at the controversies that have developed around it over the years, and the way I present it is showing that there's been controversies on both sides. That it was criticized for being too sympathetic to a man who was an escaped slave and was a piece of property that shouldn't have run away, and now it's criticized for being racist because it uses the N word a lot. And there's a lot of those pairings where people on opposite ends of political or social views criticize the novel. And to me, that's an indication that the novel is going right down the middle, and the people are latching on aspects of it that Twain did not intend. Twain was writing a book about a very racist society and a small boy's attempt to navigate and to grow as a person by encountering an African American in a way that he wouldn't have encountered him otherwise, because they're forced together when they're both fleeing the town. I don't think there's a lot of homoeroticism in the book. There is a scene where Huck and Jim are floating down the Mississippi on a raft. They have been swimming. They are lying naked on the raft. I can see people reading homoeroticism into that. I don't think that Wayne intended it to be that way. Certainly, that was one of the flashpoints for racists, saying here's this black man who is being naked with a white boy. That's something really awful. The thing that I wanted to focus on was this idea of the play that has come to be known as the Royal Nonsuch, and this question of why that story was pulled at the last moment, and whether that says about Twain himself and about Twain's readers that he was writing a very controversial book. He was writing about a runaway slave. He was writing about this relationship between a white boy and a black man. And the novel has domestic violence. It has murder. It has all sorts of bad things in it. And those were okay to go ahead. And it was this idea of a man sticking a candle up his butt was too far. And I wanted to explore that idea of why that was too far for Twain, or what Twain thought would be too far for his readers.
Yeah. And I think it's so fascinating that like a scene, you know, that Twain could even be imagining a scenario like that. Like, do you feel, William, that when people think about 19th century literature in our current day, I think there is this viewpoint, and I just say this as a like PhD scholar of 19th century literature, is there's this view that, oh, in the 19th century, um, people were more prudish or they were more buttoned up. But like what you've exposed is like, no, these kinds of sensational or very, um, I don't want to say crude because that puts it in a negative light, but erotic, like hyper sexualized images did exist. Like, why do you think maybe the public in our modern day society has these certain views that like, okay, if we just go to the past in America, they must have been more closed-minded. Like, is that what you've seen in the literature that you've looked at in the 19th century, or is that like an erroneous way of thinking about what's going
Not
on?
really. In the first couple chapters of I guess it'd be in Unruly Desires, my latest book, I go into this phenomenon that happened in the early 19th century America. In the early years, in the first 2 decades, people were very open to all sorts of sexuality, and it was openly discussed. And no, it was no big deal. You'll notice that there are very few sodomy prosecutions, although people knew that men were having sex with men. Um, and there was a society change that happened beginning around 1830, in which what we would consider Victorian mores started taking over, and gender roles started calcifying and pulling apart. And uh, it was as a result of that, you started getting things being censored, and people like Twain, who normally felt very comfortable with this kind of stuff, obviously put it in the book to begin with, started thinking, oh wow, this is a little too much. But that was not there early in the century. In Unruly Desires, I begin quoting an actual event that happened with an American naval officer traveling in Paris, and he had to share a bed with a German officer, and the German officer started sexually assaulting him, and they had a big to-do, and he started beating him up, and this showed up in the American officer's memoirs and was printed in the early 19th century. But when the book was reprinted in the early 20th century, that whole incident was taken out of the book without any indication that it had been censored. And that was because it was okay to talk about these things in the beginning of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century it wasn't. And I'm not sure of all the forces that went in play to make that change, but it definitely went through during the 19th century, and that's why the 19th century is one of the areas that is the area that I've been focusing on, because it started off being so liberal, and that got really conservative towards the end.
No, thank you for that. I feel like that's really helpful. So, you know, my last question is, did you writing this article, did it lead to any other, like, has this led you to a new project, or has this, like, is it going to make its way thinking about Mark Twain bottom shaming? Is this going to lead to another article for the Gay and Lesbian Review, even a book
Well,
project?
not
So,
necessarily going on with yeah. What I'm working on currently is gathering together the essays that I've published already in the Gay and Lesbian Review, the 12 or so. I have three that were in the hopper already because I like to write things in advance, so I have a chance to set them aside, come back and do some more research on them.
mm,
So I have been talking with Richard Snyder, the editor of Gay and Lesbian Review, about publishing a collection of all of these essays. So that's what I'm working on at the moment, and bringing them up to date and putting them in the Gay Lesbian Review. Because of the format of it, you can add some a short bibliography at the end of the essay, but it's more along the lines of uh, um, read more about it if you want to follow this topic further, but you don't use endnotes. And I figure if I'm doing a book with the essays, I want to have all the things cited, because I think it's incredibly important that I let people from the 19th century say what they said, and you don't hear me saying, well, there was a writer who once said. I try to quote as much as possible, and particularly always when I run across writing that is a direct quote of a gay man, I don't want that voice to be lost, and so I always copy that down and put that in my book so that voice gets carried on. So that's what I'm going to be working on, and that'll take me through the summer, and I hope that the book will be published in the fall.
Oh, wonderful, William. Well, everyone out there too, if you go to glreview.org and you type in William Benemann, Benemann, his last name, you will see all of William's articles. So I love that you could do that on the GL Reviews website. So, make sure you read his article from the January February issue, Bottom Shamed by Mark Twain. And everyone out there who aren't subscribers, you can type in choice as a promo code when you sign up for a digital or print subscription. I love the print subscription. I'm very like, as a millennial, still old fashioned. I love my print magazines. So they can choose the January, February issue for a free issue. So I'm excited for more to read your article, William. And it was such a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. I hope you have a great day. Bye, William.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye bye. So, after just listening to William Benemann's conversation, I'm so happy and thrilled to introduce the next Gay and Lesbian Review contributing writer. Her first article for the magazine, I learned that out preparing for this. It's called Rise and Fall of the Pansy Craze. I'm joined with Margaret Vandenburg, who actually, her article follows Williams in the magazine, which, I didn't plan that necessarily, but it works nicely. So we're going to move from Mark Twain territory. So we're moving away from the 19th century into the Roaring 20s, such an exciting period of history. And Margaret has just written a novel called Craze, a jazz age portrait of queer New York. And she also wrote a previous novel called An American in Paris, a romp through the sapphic salons of Gertrude Stein and Natalie Barney. So, welcome to the ITBR, Margaret.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with you to chat.
Yes, so I just can't wait for you to talk about even the inspiration for the Roaring Twenties. Like, first, what led you to, okay, I have to look at this period of American history and its queerness? Like, what was that through line for you?
So you mentioned the prequel novel, which was written 25 years ago. And it built on my work as an academic, which focuses on androgyny, and it always has. And the first book, which actually was just reissued by Cleus Press, and this is literally just came out again. It was really, as you mentioned, it was the sapphic salons in Paris in the 20s. And it was a kind of celebration of a part of history that a lot of people didn't know, including the lesbians who lived it. And I mean, in current lesbians who didn't know their own history. That's changing. So the original impetus in some ways was in the rearview mirror. And I knew that I would write a sequel because it ends, An American in Paris ends with the protagonist moving to New York, but I didn't feel compelled to write it, obviously, for 25 years. I wrote other things. Then we had what is happening now, which is that we had a kind of, another renaissance, another, queer renaissance, followed by another backlash. And then, because I like to write about things that I think are problematic and, pressing and even urgent, then I thought, now I have to write it because we're at this crossroads, presumably, where we've had this wonderful 20 years, and now we're at a crucial sort of inflection point where we don't know what's going to happen next. And we may have to step up and engage in a kind of militancy that they did not engage in the wake of the queer craze, and we can't afford to do that again. So that's how it came to be now, as opposed to 10 years ago, or sitting on the shelf for another 10 years.
I think that's reading your article. It really was actually very inspiring with activism. And I think that you have such a wonderful writerly voice of like not only just explaining your inspiration creatively about, okay, I'm going to turn to Virginia Woolf's Orlando, or um, how do you pronounce, is it Juna Barnes?
Yeah.
Okay. Juno Barnes is Nightwood. And that, like, that helped you understand getting into like the psyche of your protagonist, who we'll talk about. But I think you're so right. I was talking to my fiance actually. I was telling him about these interviews and like, oh, and there was a novel called Craze by this author, and this is what it's about. And like he even said the same point you just talked about, which is he asked, why does this happen? Like, why do we have such a like burst of queer culture? And I brought up to him the film Cabaret and
Mm-hmm.
musical, and right, you get like such excess of sexual decadence. But then why is there, the Weimar Republic getting its power and then forming into the Nazi party? Like, how do you feel like from even writing your novel and looking into research, even with this present moment, is it that the progress of the queer community and of marginalized identities that like those who are not who don't understand or aren't part of those communities or aren't allies or not really know people from the community, is it just fear that drives them of like, oh, we got to put a stop to whatever, you know in our current mind they've thought of as wokeism, like, right, that they need to like pull the curtain and the rug out from anyone who might fall under that? Like, why does this happen, you think, Margaret?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the way you framed it. As you know, the issue that the essay appears in is called Strange Fruit. And I think Stephen named it that and Richard, because we tend to think of, and you use the word marginalized, we tend to think of our communities and our cultural renaissances as a kind of marginal phenomenon. And I wrote in the essay, as you know, that I think when the backlash happens when it's not strange fruit, it's when it starts to be normalized. Mm. So in both cases, and people can debate this, but in some ways in the 1920s, which is when the craze occurred, and it may be different than it is now, they came into our spaces, right? Because the queer speakies and the drag balls, they were coming to us. We weren't invading their turf, which is the way they think about it. They were coming to us because it was so fun and it was such a sort of cultural matrix in New York. And so that's the terrifying thing. I mean, you mentioned fear. The terrifying thing is that it's no longer strange, and that because it's no longer strange, it starts to disrupt that, binary power structure, right? Which, as we get into it, we're going to talk about, obviously, you mentioned Virginia Woolf in particular, that she writes about how that is the threat, that fascism itself, and she uses that term, and you mentioned earlier in our correspondence, neo-fascism, and there's a lot of talk of fascism in the air. That particular power structure relies on that binary, which flips into a hierarchy, right? And at the top of that hierarchy is the fascist or the father. I mean, Virginia Woolf and Gertrude Stein herself said that there's too much fathering going on, Father Mussolini, Father Hitler. So that's why, right? I think that, yes, it's about, in a way, the breakdown of that marginalization, but, the threat is the normalcy. And this is tricky because, as you know, our community has a kind of ambivalent relationship with normalcy. So, we will or we won't talk about that. But I think that's the thing that's so terrifying to people.
Yeah, well, and I think it's so fascinating that I've been thinking a lot with this idea of neo-fascism, like, specifically as a gay white man, I almost feel in a way, again, like the transgender community has been so um pathologized and like so
Yeah.
made into these scapegoats, and it's just like really awful and horrible how they've been used as pawns in this um plan to just take away ideas around LGBTQ representation. But I do feel like you said, like, now becoming trying to like have the LGBTQ community, or those who are transgender, as your neighbors, or like just part of the society. It's no longer oh, the straight community is going to fetishize RuPaul's Drag Race, for example, or like allow for certain queer markers in society, but they don't want it to be the topic of conversation in everyday culture. But a part of me wonders, like, as a gay white man, okay, and this is speculation, but like, is the current administration's plan for us to be back in the 90s, the 80s, the 70s? Like, where in the timeline of American history are they trying to throw the queer community? Like, or is it they just want to censor the queer community and scare them from, even like you've said, the need to speak out and like demand, that they're not going away? Like, it's such a hard, and I don't know if we have an answer, but like, I'm just curious of your thoughts, Margaret. Like, where do you think they're trying this administration? Like, where are they trying to place the LGBTQ community?
I think they want to go to the night before Stonewall. In other words, when the Pansy Craze, which I call the queer craze in the novel, because I'm trying to make sure nobody's erased, when the backlash happened, which was right at the end of Prohibition, ironically, and so let's say it's the early 30s, and then that status quo gets progressively worse, but it remains until literally the 60s, right, with Stonewall. And so the process that, as you know, I mean, we are in the late stages of that new trajectory, which started in the 60s. And that's, the question is, will they turn back the clock? What would be necessary to make sure that they don't? But I am convinced that we are going back to that the night before Stonewall, if only, as evidence that we know that they're after gay marriage, of marriage equality. And so that is an indication that it's every letter in LGBTQ, not just the latter letters.
Hmm. Well, and like you said, though, like the exploring your novel, like specifically exploring who I think, everyone out there, when they read your magazine from the Gay and Lesbian Review, are going to want to read your novel, because you do such a nice job of thinking about Henry Adams, this lesbian who befriends a drag performer known as the Queen of Tarts, Crystal. And thinking of Henry Adams, though, and her experiences in the city in New York, like going to specifically the speakeasies and the drag balls, like, how when you were doing this research, how much was that part of, I'll say, the general public's consciousness in New York City? Like, were they aware of drag balls? Like, was it something that, was like the Met Gala, like, meaning not the same, high profile glamour and glitz, but was it something that was on everyone's mindset, like how entertainment is on everyone's mind when we know what's coming up in award season? Or was it an underground type of process?
Yeah. So when, if I read a passage from the book, which I won't, but that there's the Hamilton Lodge drag ball. 6,000 people were there from all over the country. Vanderbilts were there. The Astors were there. Langston Hughes, one of the useful books in my research was The Big C by Langston Hughes. Alelia Walker's salon was there. In other words, the Harlem Renaissance writers were there and the painters were there, mostly the writers, because the writers were more predominantly queer and bisexual. So everybody was there. And, you know, one of the characters in the novel is this Upper East Side lady. In other words, Henry, the protagonist, has two love interests. And one is this kind of elusive, Byron-esque, you know, mask woman. The other one is this really rich East Side lady who slums. And another book that I really loved and relied on was Chad Heap's Slumming. And it, you know, it really shows how, like I said, tried to say that, you know, everybody top to bottom was coming to the speakeasies and to the drag ball venues. And so they were not in marginalized. The Cotton Club, which had an exclusively white audience, you know, had you know, a series of queer entertainers. So, and there was a Pansy Club at Times Square. So it had ceased to be, we talked about the normalization of it, it had ceased to be underground because, and this was the paradox again, everybody was thrust into the so-called what used to be the underworld because of prohibition. And, you know, this is the great paradox of the queer craze, that it never would have happened had it not been for prohibition.
As an English professor, I would have no idea where to begin with books to assign to my students. So I absolutely love Broadview Press, who is celebrating their 40th anniversary. Broadview Press, they publish classic works of literature, academic, humanities books. I've read so many of their books, and I've always loved whatever conversations being discussed, from the philosophy of sport, indigenous philosophy and Native American culture, vampire literature, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, new edition that just came out just in time for Wicked fandom, folk and fairy tales. My students love the different Cinderella and Little Red Riding Hood fairy tales that we discussed. They always have a really exciting collection. So head on over right now to broadviewpress.com. Use the exclusive code that they gave us, Ivory Tower, for 20% off all of your orders. I hope you enjoy your reading, and please let me know and DM me with the books that you're getting from Broadview Press, because I'd love to share it with Dylan from Broadview Press, who always is curious to see what the Ivory Tower Boiler Room community is purchasing. So enjoy your reading, and I hope you discover even more exciting humanities works.
Do you feel that writing this novel, did it help you understand like how we meet this current moment, how we're going to show up as a queer community? Like, what lessons did it teach you about, even maybe if it's like the call that you're taking right now of being present in this moment? Like, how can we try to find some inspiration from a backlash, right? Something that can be so eerie, so McCarthyist, very like fellow travelers, like thinking of even Angels in America, where like you could be fired if you came out at work, like not trying to put ourselves in the mindset of thinking that this government is going to win, like that they've already taken our rights away. Because I do think like there's this type of panic where, you know, everything seems like the sky is falling and you're Chicken Little running around trying to, you know, think of all the fires that you want to extinguish, even though they're not present. But like you've already given in, right? This is like the crucial moment where you don't give in to that type of censorship and let that freedom be taken away. Like what, you know, what do we do, Margaret?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't know if I would go so far as to describe what you to label what you just described as nihilism, but there's a kind of privileged passivity is what I would call it, and maybe even there's just, it's almost deterministic in the way. I'm trying to echo what you were saying, I think. And I like the way you brought in, the word government, because, in the wake of the queer craze, that at the end of Craze, the novel, there's this fantasy. It's my fantasy, and the fantasy is that this group of characters that surrounds Henry, including Crystal, who is sort of, it's unclear whether Crystal is trans or transvestite, which is something that was probably more difficult to decipher then than now, although it's still a discussion. They get together at the end and they start to think that they're going to fight back. And so they start this queer rights project, they call it. And that's a fantasy because they didn't do that. So my question is similar to yours. What are we going to do this time? And have we lost the muscle memory, I would call it, of Stonewall and ACT UP? And I think we might have. And going back to the word government, we can't rely on government, I don't think. And there's a kind of, you probably know this, there was a drag pack that supported the Democratic ticket in the last election. Okay, that's fine. I mean, you can work from within government, but you can't work solely from within government. It's just not going to happen. It's not going to work. So I don't know. I mean, are we going to rise to the occasion as we have in the past? Because we're capable of it. Because we have a history of marginalization. This is the good news. We do have a muscle memory, but we're going to have to access it.
Yeah. And like, that's where I feel art is so powerful. Theater, film, TV, but specifically theater, literature, like those that don't have as much gatekeeping to be performed and for you to get that word out there. How's Hollywood going to respond to this? Who knows? Hollywood has such a vexed history with the LGBTQ community. But
yeah,
right, when it comes to theater, like thinking of Angels in America or thinking of Larry Kramer's The Normal Heart, there was such pivotal pieces that came from literature and theater during these tense times. So, I agree. I feel like, thinking about the muscle memory we need to remember. Like, I remember watching protests of ACT UP, like, at the I guess it was at the Capitol, but where they were even protesting Fauci and
that's
protesting,
right. Yeah.
yeah, and protesting, like even going into the church to disturb the church to like say, hey, we got to do something. There's bodies that are piling up and no one cares. And I do think to think that the government has our best interests as an LGBTQ community is so Pollyanna. Like, they don't have the best interest. I mean, maybe they've convinced us because of tokenism of like, oh, we have some in the LGBTQ community in government, but does that necessarily mean that even those representatives have the voice of the government? It doesn't, that's not who holds the power.
You
So,
used the word pawn before, and now and then I'm going to put that with tokenism, meaning that's how I feel a lot of times about the Democratic Party's relationship with our community. It's like there's a lot of yip yapping going on, and there's a lot of moving pawns around. You mentioned in particular the transgender community, and we don't need to be moved around. I sort of feel like we're their poster girls and boys. I don't want to be their poster girls and boys. So, and then to come back to what you said about Fauci, that seems to me to be the necessary strategy, because as you intimated, ACT UP had a profound effect on Fauci's approach to the AIDS epidemic, and the way in which he loosened medication access because of their pressure. I think that's right. I think that that militancy had a massive effect on politics rather than the other way around.
Yeah, and I do think that um, the younger generations, like, there's almost been um, lessons of being afraid of protesting, or like you even said, like this passive privilege, or even like acquiescing to leaders. Like, no, they'll figure it out. We don't need to be involved. But you're right. Like, remembering the power that we as a people have, you know, to protest, to revolt if things are unequal. That, like, that is part of our constitution, still is part, right? We don't want to lose that. I mean, maybe some do, and that, is a side I don't agree with. But I think that if we want to preserve, like, if we want to keep our keep a democratic spirit and urge for even more democratic policies, because, right, I think that's the whole other issue is we don't have a representative democracy. Um, like, are we going to further allow for these restrictions to take place? But that's where I feel like your novel and what you wrote about, thinking about the pansy craze and then the backlash, that these are lessons we need to know, like, and we need to realize that just because they're in the past doesn't mean it can't be repeated. Or even, I think sometimes, I was saying this to William, Margaret, like, and I'm curious of your take as we like wrap up. This has been so illuminating, but is so many people, I feel, when you talk about the past, like you talk about the Roaring Twenties, they're like, oh, they were more conservative minded, or they were buttoned up, or they were more prudish. Like, we've become so much more evolved, and it's like, is that really true? Like, were they not as open minded in certain regards? Like, how do you feel about that when people think about past history? They usually like to see things through a progress narrative. Like, is that always the case?
Yeah, I mean, I think in particular to, the politics of gender fluidity, right? So we were talking about protests, that's physical on the ground, politics, but there's also the politics of gender fluidity. And, I think you're right that the assumption is that the 20s couldn't possibly have been as quote unquote radical as our current moment. And as you know, and you mentioned this earlier, that the article in Gay and Lesbian Review, and then it also, figures prominently in Craze, quotes Orlando and Nightwood, by Virginia Woolf and Juna Barnes, respectively. And people know, if they remember Orlando, I'll just read very briefly, that Orlando experiences, and then I'm quote, a change of sex, though it altered their future, did nothing whatsoever to alter their identity. And, the language there is there, right? As in not he or she, but there, number one. And number two, it's this deep inquiry into the extent to which this, the way that somebody presents does or doesn't reflect who they are, right? And I could go on, but the point is that the language was already there. The understanding of the complexities and the various forms of gender fluidity were already there. And there are ways in which I sometimes wonder whether the 1920s were more radical than now, and that we have to look back carefully, or if it's not even looking back, maybe look forward, because there's no need to reinvent the wheel, right? That we have to somehow coalesce around, it's almost like gender best practices, and get over this sort of progressive idea of gender.
Yeah. And I also do feel like the biggest obstacle or hurdle, I can just talk from like someone who grew up with social media, but I do feel like social media has become such a tricky force because it gets the word out there. But I do think some people think that just posting on social media counts as activism. But you just, again, not saying it's not important to share resources. Of course it is. Or like to talk about a march that's going to happen, or like, pressuring your legislators. Yes, all of that's great. But you just voicing a critique you have out there on social media, you know, and trying to, even if it's like react in real time to every illogical, chaotic policy that has been passed, isn't exact. That's like not forming a coalescing, a coalition. What am I trying to say? A coalition of activism. It's not bringing people together. It's just griping, right? So
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think even for us to understand how to best use social media to get people out there, like to physically have change of activist spirit, is I think another hurdle that needs to be addressed, because I think maybe that's also really changed the landscape of demonstrating. Is now we have a cell phone in our hands that constantly so many are addicted to.
Yeah, I mean, it could definitely work in both ways. We can use it to advantage,
Mm-hmm.
but it has always been the case. I don't like it, but it's true that in order for protests to be effective, you have to have skin in the game.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
we can get the bodies out there with social media, as you said, and that's great. But we need to put our bodies on the line if necessary. We don't know if it's necessary yet, but if it is, we have to be willing to do that, because again, why did the civil rights movement work? Why did Stonewall work? People had skin in the game.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Well,
And
with
we're
that,
talking about bodies, right? Anyway, this is about bodies.
yes. Yeah. And it has to be, like you said, a joint effort. And I think something that, you know, is optimistic is how those from different, those who are on the front line of policies that are affecting immigrants, specifically affecting those who are undocumented, is the groups are starting to join together, like realizing that,
Mm-hmm.
oh, we're part of this. Like, this isn't just your fight or my fight
Yeah,
or, a feminist fight. Like, the groups have to form a coalition together. Like, I don't think anymore there can be just, singular identity types of activism, because it's not working that way.
that's tricky too. I
Hmm.
agree with you, but the coalition in the context of identity politics, there's a tension, and we're going to have to relieve that tension in order to go in the direction that you just indicated. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, again, like you said, to focus on just thinking the Democrats are going to have your best interest, and you can just think about who you're going to vote for in the next, 2 years or 4 years. Well, first of all, you should be thinking, I hope I have that vote. And maybe instead of thinking about that far in the future, let's think right now. What can you do in your own community? Even if it's, I'm going to continue teaching this work and spreading it to my students,
Yeah,
or,
yeah,
right? Education has a really powerful impact. Or, I'm not going to censor my, conversations with my neighbors. Like, I'm going to say, you know, um, my wife and I, my husband and I, whoever, your partner is from the queer community, you're not going to, walk on eggshells. And I think that's something else too, is like people do start to police their speech. And that's where I just hope there isn't a um, wave of fear, like a wave of McCarthy fear of, oh, I'm going to like kowtow to this manipulation strategy. Because that's really what it is. It's like they're trying to see how much they can control the public.
hmm
And,
right.
I,
And I love the way you said that, because then we're policing ourselves before it happens.
yeah.
Those are
And
important examples, even in the realm of language again, right?
yeah. And if we do that, then you might as well just like throw in the towel,
Yeah.
because, you can't get, like, we haven't lost the progress too at the same time. And I think that's a hard thing to learn, but I think we are. This is where Gen Z, I think, is in a good position, is they've been exposed to so much representation on social media. So like using that to their to activist advantage to say, do you want to lose all of that access to entertainment? Like that's going to affect the Gen Zers. Like that's going to affect society. And I think you're right, though. The hardest obstacle is how do you get everyone on the same page? And a lot of that is going to be letting go of egos. And, that's not an easy that's not an easy call for activists, like different groups to come together. But it's going to have to be done, I think, in order to face whatever is coming
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah.
But this is so inspiring, Margaret. I mean, I feel more optimistic. And I think your novel, Just Crazed, does such a good job looking into our past to understand our present. And like, that's why I always feel we need to know queer liberation stories from across the decades, the centuries. Everyone make sure you read Rise and Fall of the Pansy Craze. It's in the January-February issue of the Gay and Lesbian Review. You can get Margaret's novel Crazed and
Here's
An American
Crazed.
in Paris. Yes, very beautiful cover. I love it. So I know Margaret has a website, right, Margaret?
Yep.
Okay.
MargaretVandenburg.com.
Great. Very easy. Okay, so thank you so much, Margaret.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Very great conversation, and I'm happy for more people to hear your thoughts. I think it's so important right now.
And back at you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, well, have a great day, Margaret.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Now, were those two exciting interviews or what? I had such a wonderful time talking to both William Benemann and Margaret Vandenburg. And I actually have another contributing writer from the Gay and Lesbian Review, Laurence Senelick, who, in an unorthodox way, isn't actually in the Zoom room with me to do an audio video discussion, but I was able to get his written responses to my questions. So I'm going to read to you all a little information about Laurence Senelick. So his earliest contribution to the Gay and Lesbian Review was before the Gay and Lesbian Review had its current name. It was actually called the Harvard Gay and Lesbian Review. So it started at Harvard University. And he was writing a memorial tribute and obituary essay for his friend, the gay pornographer, John Preston. I'm sure you all are now going to be searching for who John Preston is. Just be careful if you're at work that you're not doing it on a work computer. Word to the wise. Then he was asked to review an exhibition of George Platt Lynn's photographs at Harvard, and it appeared in the Gay and Lesbian Review as the article Learning One's Lines. I guess that solves the conundrum I've always had in my head, is how you pronounce George Platt Lynes' name. Well, thank you, Laurence, because his article is a pun, Learning One's Lines. See? The more we know. You could actually find that in the March and April 2003 issue on glreview.org. Remember, you can always search for the archive of Gay and Lesbian Review magazines. So a few of his other articles he wanted me to talk about that discuss mostly his discussion about either sodomy or different aspects of theater, the French court even. One is called Out Came the First Coming Out Play in the May to June 2007 issue. I like this title, Lesbians, Please Leave the Stage. I want to read that because I want to know what is going on. Such, an on the edge of your seat title. That's in the May-June 2015 issue. Another really interesting one is Jean Lorraine, Ambassador from Sodom. That's in the March-April 2023 issue. And then the one that he just did in the January-February issue is called Sodomy at the Court of Louis XIV. So at first, his articles were about episodes in the history of gay theater, which derived from his academic research, what he says could be called shavings from his workshop. The Siriano article he did was written to celebrate Siriano's 400th birthday. Some were intended for specially themed issues. The Jean Lorraine piece for the Age of Innocence number. I love the Age of Innocence. I like anything very Edith Wharton inspired. So the House of Mirth, is her novel, but if anyone you're watching The Gilded Age right now, I cannot wait for The Gilded Age season 3 to come out. And don't worry, I have a Gilded Age episode I've been holding on to. So if Sheila Lemming is listening, Sheila is an Edith Wharton scholar. I recorded this episode with her about a year ago. I have been holding on to it in anticipation for season 3 coming out. So it will premiere when season 3 of The Gilded Age comes back. So my fiance is actually now watching The Gilded Age. And he has it on anytime I come from teaching or I'm just like coming back to the apartment. I even just love it as background aesthetic viewing. It is such a wonderful series. I have to say, I like it more than Downton Abbey. Maybe I'm an American uh, biased viewer, which I am, but I love the New York City Gilded Age history, so that's probably why as well. So if you are watching the Gilded Age, reach out to me. I'd love to know who else is watching. Okay, so back to Laurence's articles. Besides fitting the theme of gossip for this issue, the January-February issue, Sodomy at the Court of Louis XIV was a natural sequel to his articles he had written on Siriano and Henry III. He was already familiar with the subject from his previous research, so nothing really surprised him necessarily about the research he discovered regarding Louis XIV and sodomy, but um, he does want to point out that sodomy was very prevalent among the French aristocracy of the time. There was actually a phrase for these aristocratic, sodomitical, mostly men, highborn sodomites. So they infiltrated every stratum of court society, including the army and the government. So, the ill-defined term sodomy was categorized as both a sin and a crime. If you don't know, sodomy is just basically any sexual activity that doesn't result in procreation. A lot of it is pleasurable sex. It could be sex between men and women, but it has to be, right, pleasurable. 69ing, that falls under sodomy. Not that I know that about between men and women. I don't. But I know other kinds of 69ing between men and men. But any sexual activity between a same-sex couple, a lot of the French aristocrats who were men at the time, who were having pleasurable sex with each other, they could have been punished by the court. So they could have even been burned at the stake, Laurence says. Wow. Whew. That reminds me of A Midsummer Night's Dream. I just finished teaching that. Do you know that Hermia is actually threatened by Aegeus, her father, that if she does not marry Demetrius, he will have her executed. Executed for not marrying this man. Crazy. Okay. So, as Louis pointed out, Laurence says, if he were to instigate a purge of sodomites, if he wanted to get rid of all of the sodomites in his court, he would have to include his brother and a number of Jesuits, as well as his best generals. Huh? It was in all strata of French society. However, in the period he discusses, Louis had come under the influence of Mademoiselle de Montaignan. I don't know if I pronounced that right. My French is not the best, so if I did pronounce that wrong, forgive me. And the circle of devotees, an ostentatiously pious Catholic sect, whom Moliere makes fun of in his play Tartuffe. So, faced with the outrageous behavior of a number of young noblemen, the king felt it necessary to clamp down on so-called sodomitical activity, but only through a royal fiat, not by going to law. Okay, so one of the reasons he really enjoys writing for the Gay and Lesbian Review is its refreshing difference from academic publishing. He doesn't have to supply footnotes. There's no elaborate and time-consuming vetting process. One can write accessible prose, and that's also why I love the Gay and Lesbian Review. Sorry, Laurence, not to just insert my own perspective here, but it really is. The Gay and Lesbian Review is an incredible magazine that talks all about not only classic and emerging and exciting LGBT literature, but also TV shows, film, theater, pop culture. It mixes high and lowbrow LGBT art and provides a platform for us to have a conversation. So I just really want to echo what Laurence you've written. He loves addressing a wider and more varied readership, introducing his material that he's writing about to those who probably wouldn't know about, say, Louis XIV and all these French aristocratic sodomites. Some of his articles were spin-offs from his books. His books include Lovesick, Modernist Plays of Same-Sex Love, and The Changing Room, Sex, Drag, and Theater. At the present time and at his age, he's not contemplating any long-term projects, but he does have an unfinished work on the popular imagery of homosexuals in the 19th and early 20th century. I would love to see that, Laurence. So if you're listening, I'd love for you to send some of what you have to me. Since it requires a considerable number of illustrations, he doubts if it will easily find a publisher. Yeah, if you're listening right now and you don't know, getting an academic book published with a lot of illustrations requires an immense amount of copyright. And a lot of academic presses don't want to publish it because their budget is already so small that they don't have the budget for illustrations. But Laurence, you might want to see if a popular press might want to publish your book. Definitely, there's some great presses I can think of. Okay, so he's saying some of those bits from the unpublished work hopefully may find their way into future Gay and Lesbian Review magazines. So I'm excited for that. So there's another one of the contributing writers, Laurence Senelick, and I really hope that those of you listening, make sure you go to glreview.org right now. Hopefully during this recording, you've been looking them up. Their current issue is the March and April issue. It's called Origins. When did the LGBT movement begin? It's an encore issue, so it features, as Richard, the founder and the editor has told me, it includes a collection of some of the best essays to discuss the origin story of the LGBT movement. Some of these articles include David Carter's What Made Stonewall Different, Will Roscoe's The Making of the Mattachine, Rebecca Batley's A Sacred Order for Sexual Outsiders, Finn Ballard's The House That Hirschfeld Built, referencing Magnus Hirschfeld, John D'Amelio's The Case for Frank Kemeny Place, Eve Goldberg's 1967 Protest at the Black Cat. So I'm going to have a few of those writers on the next episode of the Gay and Lesbian Review Profile Magazine podcast episode. I hope you're liking this. Let me know if there's anything else you want me to talk about from the Gay and Lesbian Review. I would love to hear from all of you. This is the first time I'm not profiling or interviewing just one of the writers and learning more about them, but specifically discussing their articles for the magazine. So it's a feature profile type episode. Okay. Also, please rate, review the Ivory Tower Boiler Room, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. YouTube is huge. Please, I'm trying to get more people on our YouTube. We're growing there. You can watch a lot of our video episodes on YouTube with ads. Yes, I know some people comment and they say, can you please not have ads? Just to give you all a tip, the reason you can listen to the podcast for free is because I have sponsors, okay? Thanks to my sponsors, Gay and Lesbian Review, Broadview Press. Thank you. So, Spotify, of course. If you don't want ads, though, if you want to, I guess, be really in the Ivory Tower Boiler Room of sorts, you can join our Patreon for $5 to $10. Just patreon.com/Ivory Tower Boiler Room. We have a free book club. We are reading The Wilds right now by Louis Bayard. If you are a Victorian England historical fiction fan, you'll love it. I've done research on Oscar Wilde for my dissertation. I really love all of his queer martyr narrative. So that's on March 30th 5 p.m. Email me, ivorytowerboilerroom.com. Just put book club in the subject, and I'll make sure that you get the Zoom link. Again, it's free. Please share the word. I really appreciate it. Go to glreview.org, go to their subscribe section, and there are 2 codes that they gave me, 2 bonus codes. You can either use ITBR50 for 50% off your digital or your print subscription. I highly recommend the print magazine, but again, I love getting magazines. I just think it's my fiance can tell you anytime a magazine comes, Gay and Lesbian Review, The New Yorker, I'm a giddy child. I just love having it in my hands. But they do have a great digital edition too. Or you can use their code CHOICE. CHOICE will get you a free issue with a subscription. So you could just put in choice and you'll see that you can put a date of an issue that you want for free. So if you want to read these articles that I discussed with the guest today, you could just put in January, February 2025. Okay. If you need any help with that, please let me know. And I hope you all just have a really wonderful rest of the week and are staying motivated, uplifted, finding groundedness. I know for me, walking is really helping maintain my mental clarity. My fiance and I are, you know, forming a stronger bond through our walks, and he's now making dinner. So, you know, I don't want to say too much because he can hear me. Okay. Well, everything has been very, very complimentary. So I'm sure he'll enjoy when he listens back to this, which I know he does. Okay. Bye, everyone.